Good to have each one back this evening. We do appreciate you for being here. Encourage, if you would, to be getting your Bibles out and turning with me to the book of Psalms, chapter 10. Psalms chapter 10. In a few moments, we're going to look at the chapter in its entirety. There's 18 verses there. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight and try to get inside the mind of the wicked. There's been a lot of television shows over the years that tried to delve inside the mind of those that were wicked and criminally insane and so forth. Just, I think, last week or the week before, a very long-running series had its last show, Criminal Minds. Criminal Minds was like one of the modern-day inside the mind of a killer type shows. Now, this will date me, but I can go back and remember the Alfred Hitchcock series back like 200-something years ago that used to be on, and between them have been many shows and many specials, many newscasts and specials concerning the minds of wicked people, trying to help us to have a better understanding of why wicked people are what they are, why they do the things that they do. Well, we're not going to have an expose on wicked minds tonight, but I would challenge that Psalms 10 gives us at least 3 reasons, 3 things to look at, 3 things that are definitely within the mind of the wicked. So let's read it together, and then we're going to look at the 3 things that are spoken of concerning inside the mind of the wicked. Psalms chapter 10, verse 1 beginning. The psalmist asked, "Why standest thou afar off, O Lord? Why hidest thou in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in devices that they have imagined. For the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blesses the covetous whom the Lord abhorreth. The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after God. God is not in all his thoughts. His ways are always grievous. Thy judgments are far above, out of his sight. As for all his enemies, he puffeth at them. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved, for I shall never be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. Under his tongue is mischief and vanity. He sitteth in the lurking places of the villages. In the secret place doth he murder the innocent. His eyes are privately set against the poor. He lieth in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lieth in wait to catch the poor. He doth catch the poor when he draweth him into his net. He croucheth and humbleth himself, that the poor may fall by the strong ones. He hath said in his heart, God hath forgotten. He hideth his face, he will never see it. Arise, O Lord, O God. Lift up thine hand, forget not the humble. Wherefore doth the wicked contemn God? He hath said in his heart, Thou wilt not require it. Thou hast seen it, for thou beholdest mischief and spite, to requite it with thy hand. The poor committeth himself unto thee. Thou art the helper of the fatherless. Break thou the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness till thou find none. The Lord is king forever and ever. The heathen are perished out of his hand. Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. Thou wilt prepare their heart. Thou wilt cause thine ear to hear, to judge the fatherless and the oppressed, that the man of the earth may no more oppress. As we look at this psalm, this is a psalm that, if you're not really paying attention, is kind of questioning God. But it's not a question to God, it's a plea to God from the psalmist that he take note of those who are evil in their mind, who are wicked in their minds. And he's saying in this particular psalm that they think that all of this is under their control. But he concludes, God, you are God. You are the Lord, and you know these things, and you will have your way. So it is, in the least, a prayer, and also a desire of the writer that God would take note of the innocent and continue to protect them and to give them strength in the times that those who are wicked would oppress them. So 3 things I'd like to consider from the text, and there are more than 3 as I was looking over the lesson and getting some ideals with it. Just pulling 3 of several things that it says here as we look inside the mind of the wicked. The first thing, as we notice in verse 4, says that God is not in their thoughts. They don't think about God. They don't consider the person of God. It's as though their world is their own. That they're in charge of their own life, their own destiny. Their position of life is to take what you want and to gain all you can. Forget about the feelings and the needs of those around you. Because why? Because they're wicked. And they simply don't care. They simply have not thought about God. Turn with me to the book of Romans, chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. I'd like to look at a couple of verses there. Verse 20 of Romans 1 and also verse 28. Paul says, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they," and the they he's speaking of, he begins earlier about those that are wicked and evil, those that are, verse 18, the ungodly and the unrighteous of the world. He says, they are without excuse. And then notice verse 28. "And even as they, those same, did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient." So Paul says here that there are those in the world that are ungodly, those that are unrighteous among us, and that God realizes that, and that God understands the workings of the minds of these people. They have no excuse. You know, ignorance is one thing. Willful ignorance is yet another thing. And Paul is alleging that these are ungodly and unrighteous because they want to be. I would dare say that the psalmist is saying that these are they that have deliberately chosen the position of life that they take. They live by their golden rule. If I have the gold, I rule. If you have gold, I'll take it from you. And that is their thought process. Now, I have said many times over the years, using using the analogy of garbage in, garbage out, right? GIGO. I think that we can use that same acronym in this lesson tonight and in this particular point tonight as we think about and consider God. God in, God out, right? It's saying the same thing on the other side of that very coin. So if we don't have God in our thoughts, then we're going to do ungodly things and think ungodly ways. The more we take and put God in us, through His Word, through our service, through our diligent study of the Bible, through our prayer life, the more we're going to seek to be in favor of God. But the psalmist says they don't have God in their minds. They don't think about God. That's not what motivates and encourages them. The wisdom of Solomon tells us in the book of Proverbs, chapter 23 and verse 7, he says, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he." If we think about godly things, we become that. If we neglect to think about godly things, then evil things then will dictate our mind and our heart and our thoughts. And that's what we become. So when the psalmist says in verse 4 that God is not all His thoughts, in all His thoughts, then there is room there for evil to creep in. You know, Satan never takes a day off. He's always at work. He's always trying to find an angle that he can get into our life. There's a story told by Christ about an individual that had cleaned their house. But once they cleaned it, they didn't do anything in it, anything good, so that evil, those spirits that had been there, came back and brought more with them. We've used the analogy over the years, you know, and had sermons on, it's not just enough to pour the contents of a cup out that may be old and molded and mildewed, but you have to clean the cup before it can be used and then fill it up and use it. If we're not using our mind, we understand the words to be true then. That an idle mind becomes the devil's workshop. What is it that takes us to think about God? What does it take? For some people, there has to be some catastrophe in their life, some calamity in their life, some heartache in their life, some time of struggle in their life. Just imagine for just a moment that you were on an airplane and you were flying somewhere and the pilot came on and said that we're beginning to make our final approach. And then there is a pause because you're thinking, finally, we get out of this big chunk of metal, we get to land and walk on earth again. But after the pause, it comes back on and he says, it is my obligation according to the Geneva Convention for those of you who believe in God to commence praying. We have a problem. How many people who think of God regularly are going to start praying? Probably all. How many who very seldom think about God? God's not a part of their life. All of a sudden, they're going to be the most religious, God-fearing, God-praying people on the planet Earth, right? Why then in our everyday life can it be as important to us to have God on our mind, God in our heart, as during those times when trouble comes? Because when those times come, and they will, we will be better prepared for them. When we stop thinking about God, we make it easy then for Satan to take over and to control our thoughts. The second thing I would like to see inside the mind of the wicked, coming from verse 11, they think that God just does not see. In verse 11 it says, concerning God that he's forgotten, he's hidden his face, and he will never see it. You know, just because we do things or think things or say things and others don't know about it, doesn't mean that God doesn't see it. I guess that a lot of times people are just waiting for God to, as it were, rain fire and brimstone down from heaven and destroy wicked deeds. It's not that God can't do that. He's done it before. But I'm glad that God chooses not to do that. How many of us would even be here tonight if God still did that to those who were disobedient? How many of us would stand a chance, right? There was a story told to be true about a college professor by the name of Dr. Lee that taught chemistry. And for over 20 years he had dominated his class. And in that time, he, as an atheist, a proclaimed atheist, would, at the very last day of his class, try to prove his point that God isn't real. He would have a student body there of 300 in his class who learned a lot concerning chemistry. In fact, as he tried to disprove God through chemistry, unknowingly he proved God through chemistry. Nonetheless, the last day of class, it was his habit and custom to do, he would ask that class, is there anyone here after this semester who still believe in God? The class would be quiet, and he would stand and look around, and then with great pride would say, I thought not. And one year, a young boy who was from the country, didn't know any better, he trusted God and had professed his Christianity on the college campus, and found out one day that by requirement he would have to take this chemistry class under Dr. Lee. And he learned a lot. But the whole semester he worried and feared, what am I going to do? Do I dare stand up? Will he ridicule me? Will he belittle God in front of 300 of my fellow students and once again win his argument? Because what he would do is stand and say, if there is a God, if that God is powerful, and he would hold a piece of chalk up and he would turn it loose to drop it and say, then let him not allow this chalk to break. And he'd drop it on the tiled floor, and of course, we know what happened. It hit the floor, it shattered into pieces, and he would say, I've proven my point. There is no God. He has no power. Well, this young man, he stayed up nearly all night long, worried about the last day of the semester, praying and asking God for guidance and leadership. What can I do? And sure enough, at the close of the class, he took that old arbitrary piece of chalk off of the chalk rail and he held it up and he says, well, y'all know what's coming. Are there any here that still believe in God? The back of the class, you heard the shuffling of feet as this young man stood up to proclaim that he believed in God. And the professor held the chalk up and he says, young man, do you want me to demonstrate to you that there is no God? He said, sir, I believe there is a God. And that is, he is in control of things. And he took the chalk and flipped it up into the air. And he was looking at it, just waiting for it to come and fall. And as it began to tumble down, it hit him on the chest and rolled down his breeches leg and into the cuff of his pants, off his shoe, rolled across the floor to the front row of students. He stood there with his mouth wide open, speechless, left the room, quit teaching, never to be seen again. You see, God sees everything. God is absolutely in control. David had made the claim himself in another passage that no matter where I go, God is there. If I ascend to the highest peak, He's there. If I descend into the depths of the ocean, He's already there. Wherever I go, God is there. God sees everything. God knows all that we do. He knows our every work. The book of Ecclesiastes, we quoted the wisdom of Solomon from Proverbs in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. He says in verse 14, "For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be bad." King James Version uses the word evil, and rightly so. The Hebrew writer, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. He says, "Neither is there any creature that is not manifest in His sight, that is seen in His sight. But all things are naked and open unto the eyes of Him whom we have to do." Sometimes we think in our minds that, all the things that are going on around us, that God's not paying attention. Why does God allow such evil in the world? If God's truly in control, why does God allow bad things to happen into the lives of people today? I would have you to understand that God's in control, and God has allowed those things to happen. And for His own reason, and in His own timing. Sometimes we have to hit bottom before we can begin coming up out of whatever despair that we're in. There's times that you try to help someone who's spiraling out of control and heading downward in such a pace, they cannot be helped until they hit bottom. And sometimes God allows that very thing to happen. We could recite example after example. I think about King David. He was in charge. He was God's choice. Sitting on the balcony looking over his kingdom while his soldiers had went off to battle to guard and protect the kingdom and to take what it is that they wanted. King David looked across and saw a beautiful woman bathing on the rooftop and ultimately had his way with her. Why? Because nobody was looking and he was the king and nobody could do nothing about it. Not even her. She could not refuse the king. We know how that story ended, do we not? God was looking. God sees everything. In the darkest recesses of our mind and in the secret times and places of those things that we do in our life, when we think that God isn't paying attention, that God isn't looking, God is always looking. God sees all. God will reveal all. On that day, when Christ returns with His angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who know not God and those who have not obeyed the gospel of Christ. God sees all, regardless of what is in the mind that controls those who are wicked. And then the third thing that we're going to look at this evening, from verse 13, they think that God will not hold them accountable. The psalmist says that thou wilt not require it. God won't hold judgment against those who are wicked. If that were true, then all of the Bible is false. Again, if that statement is true, all of the Bible is false. We go back to the beginning. God told Adam and Eve, the very first of His creation, as they were in the garden, to give them specific things to do, specific things not to do. And He gave them also an ultimatum if they broke those things that God said. The one thing God forbid. The one tree that God forbid, they partook of. God told them that in the day that you do, you'll die. Satan said, you won't surely die. But they did. They were living a life of immortality. As long as they were in the garden and in the presence of the tree of life and partaking of it, they would have lived forever. They were taken out of the garden because of their sin against God's commands. They began that very moment because of their separation from the garden, thus their separation from God, dying physically and absolutely dying spiritually. We need to understand God will hold us accountable for everything in our life. In the book of Matthew, turn with me there, Matthew chapter 16. I'd like to look at the 21st verse beginning through verse 23. Matthew 16, verse 21 through verse 23. And from that time forth, began Jesus to show unto His disciples how that He must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things at the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. Verse 22. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. But he, Jesus, turned and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men. Some things in life are necessary. Some things in life are absolute. If we are born, we will die. And then the judgment. That's an absolute. Christ came for the very purpose of being put to death, to die for the sins of mankind. And who did Simon Peter think he was to tell Christ, you're not going to do that? When we think about that and think how foolish that was and how blind that was, but yet at the same time, we have to look at it and see His compassion for Christ. That He didn't want Him to suffer these things. He didn't want Him to be put to death. Christ held Him accountable at that moment. Now this is the same Simon Peter that He said, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Right? The same Simon Peter in Acts 2 that says, And when Peter and the 11 stood on the day of Pentecost, the same one. He says here, Get thee behind me, Satan. God will hold us accountable for the things that we have done in the flesh. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 10 and 11. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. Knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men, but we are made manifest, known, visible, seen unto God, and I trust also are made manifest in your consciences. Paul says here to the church at Corinth that there is a day of accounting coming. Christ described in Matthew's account the day of judgment. How that God would bring all people, all nations of all time before Him and separate them, the left and the right, the sheep and the goats. And that God would judge all nations. Wicked people with wicked minds think and contend that there is no judgment, that God will not hold them accountable. They have gotten by with those things that they have done. Nothing's happened to them. They're safe, and life is good. When we see others do wrong, even as good people, even as God's people, sometimes when we see others do wrong, we prefer to be judge, often jury, and even from time to time executioner. We want justice. God will give justice. If not in this life, God will give judgment and justice, because that's who God is. Let us not allow our minds to be like that of the wicked. Let us not think that God is not going to hold us or others accountable, because He will. Let us not think that God doesn't see what's going on in the world around us. It's not that God's okay with it, but that God allows it. And God's got a reason and a purpose. It breaks God's heart, just like it did to watch His Son hang there on that cross. It breaks His heart. But yet God has allowed us to be the free moral agents, to think and to choose for ourselves that He created us to be. Let's not think that we don't need God in our life, in our mind, in our everyday thinking. Let's not wait for those times when we need to call on God, to call on Him. Let's think about God and His Word. Let's pray. Let's talk to God on a regular basis. Let's guard our minds and not to allow the foolishness of the world to dictate how we live and how we think. It's not pretty to look into the mind of someone that's evil. That's easy for us to envision and see, isn't it? But for God, it's not easy to look into the heart of one who is disobedient. How does God see us today? As God looks into our life, into our hearts, into our minds, how does God see us? What is it that is the thoughts of our mind today? If we have need for growth, for change, for correction, let us take advantage of that opportunity, even at this time, as together we'll stand and sing 685.